Hey there. Tonight we're stepping back not to royal courts or grand cathedrals, but to the shadows of history, the places where death didn't announce itself with trumpets or fanfare. We're talking about medieval plagues, the invisible killers that swept through villages like whispered secrets, leaving behind empty homes and unmarked graves. The diseases that didn't care about your prayers, your station, or your plans for tomorrow. If this kind of quiet, contemplative history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something strangely comforting about knowing we're all here together, sharing these forgotten stories across the darkness. So dim the lights. Maybe light a candle if you have one. Settle in, and let's begin in a world where sickness wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the ever-present shadow that followed you through every season, every harvest, every quiet moment when you thought you might finally be safe. The thing about medieval plagues is that they didn't start with the Black Death. That's just the one that got famous, the one that made it into the history books because it killed so many people so quickly that even the nobles had to pay attention. But long before that great dying swept across Europe, medieval peasants were already intimately acquainted with disease, not as visitors, but as neighbors. Sickness lived in their villages like an unwelcome relative who never quite left. You have to understand, in the medieval world, there was no clear line between being healthy and being sick. Health wasn't a state you achieved and maintained. It was more like a brief reprieve between episodes of something going wrong. A cut that wouldn't heal properly. A cough that lingered through 3 seasons. A fever that came and went like the phases of the moon. Children who grew thin despite eating. Old people who grew thinner still. The air itself felt different when plague was near. Not just the smell, though that was part of it. The way smoke hung lower. The way conversations stopped mid-sentence. The way even the dogs seemed quieter, as if they too understood that something was moving through the village that shouldn't be disturbed. Most people didn't know what caused disease. How could they? The word germ wouldn't be invented for centuries. What they had instead were theories, passed down through generations like heirloom recipes. Some believed in miasma, the idea that bad air carried sickness. If a place smelled wrong, rotting, stagnant, thick with the odor of unwashed bodies and animal waste, then that air could poison you. So people carried bundles of herbs, pressed flowers to their faces, burned incense when they could afford it, not because it worked, but because it was something to do. Others believed illness came from God, a punishment for sins, a test of faith, a reminder of mortality. If your child fell sick, you searched your memory for transgressions. Had you worked on the Sabbath, spoken harshly to your neighbor, coveted something that wasn't yours? The sickness became a kind of spiritual detective work, trying to figure out what you'd done wrong and how to make it right. Then there were the local explanations, the evil eye from a jealous neighbor, the alignment of stars, the phase of the moon, a curse from someone you'd wronged, the proximity to running water or stagnant pools, whether you'd walked through a cemetery at twilight or touched something that had been touched by the dead. The cures were as varied as the supposed causes. Bleeding, of course, always bleeding. The idea was that illness came from an imbalance in your bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, too much of one, not enough of another. So they'd open a vein and let the bad blood flow out, hoping to restore the balance. Sometimes they used leeches, sometimes sharp stones, sometimes just a rusty knife and a prayer. There were poultices made from whatever herbs grew nearby. Crushed garlic, boiled nettles, ground up bones, bread soaked in wine or vinegar. You'd wrap these in cloth and tie them to the affected area, hoping the sickness would somehow transfer into the mixture. and leave your body in peace. Some remedies were more dramatic. If you had a fever, you might be wrapped in wet sheets and left outside in the cold. If you had chills, you might be placed near a fire until you sweated. If you had a headache, someone might drill a small hole in your skull to release the pressure. If you had a stomachache, you might be given wine mixed with crushed pearls or ground unicorn horn, if you could afford such luxuries. For the most part, though, when you got sick, you just endured it. You lay in your straw bed, sharing space with your family and livestock, breathing the same smoky air as everyone else. You drank whatever liquid they could spare, ate whatever broth they could make from bones and roots. You listened to the sounds of the village continuing around you, the daily rhythm of work and worry, and you waited to see whether you'd recover or join the growing number of graves behind the church. The thing about medieval plagues is that they move differently than we might expect. Not always in great waves that swept across continents, but in smaller, quieter patterns. A sickness might appear in one village and stay there for months, taking people slowly, methodically, before finally burning itself out. Or it might hop from settlement to settlement along trade routes, carried by merchants and pilgrims who had no idea they were bringing death with them. Sometimes it was dysentery, the bloody flux that could empty a village in weeks. Sometimes it was smallpox, leaving survivors scarred and blinded. Sometimes it was what we'd now call influenza, but which they simply called the fever, the sweating sickness, the wasting disease. Sometimes it was tuberculosis, the slow death that ate you from the inside out, leaving you coughing blood and growing thinner until you were more ghost than person. And sometimes it was leprosy, the disease that turned you into a living exile. If you showed the signs, the discoloured skin, the loss of feeling in your extremities, the gradual decay of flesh, you were declared legally dead. You had to carry a bell to warn others of your approach. You couldn't enter churches, markets, or homes. You lived in special colonies outside the village walls, supported by charity and forgotten by everyone except God. The arrival of serious plague was something you felt before you saw. The way conversations grew quieter, the way people avoided each other's eyes, the way mothers pulled their children closer when strangers passed, the way the priest's sermons grew longer and more urgent, the way food prices rose as farmers stopped coming to market. Then came the deaths. Not all at once, usually. A child here, an old man there. Someone who'd been sick for a while and finally succumbed. People told themselves it was normal, the natural order of things. But then the deaths came faster. The young and healthy started falling. The gravedigger couldn't keep up. The priest ran out of time for proper funerals. During the worst outbreaks, the ones that later chroniclers would write about in Latin texts that peasants couldn't read, entire villages simply emptied. Not because everyone died, though many did, but because the survivors fled. They packed what they could carry and walked away from everything they'd ever known, hoping to outrun the sickness that had already taken their neighbours, their families, their sense that anywhere was truly safe. Some of these refugees carried the disease with them, spreading it to new places. Others died on the roads, their bodies left for scavengers. A few found new homes, new communities willing to take them in. But most simply vanished from the historical record, their stories lost to time. The Black Death, when it finally came in the 14th century, wasn't just another plague. It was the plague that broke the medieval world's back. It killed so many people so quickly that the entire social structure began to collapse. There weren't enough peasants to work the fields. There weren't enough priests to bury the dead. There weren't enough living to properly mourn the departed. The symptoms were unlike anything people had seen before. Swellings in the neck and groin, called buboes, that grew to the size of apples. Fever that made people delirious. skin that turned black and began to rot while the person was still alive, blood that darkened and refused to clot, death that came in days, sometimes hours. Some people tried to flee. They loaded carts with their possessions and headed for distant relatives, remote monasteries, anywhere that might be far enough away to be safe. But the plague travelled faster than feet or horses. It rode with merchants and soldiers, with pilgrims and peddlers, with anyone who moved from place to place. Others turned to religion with desperate intensity. They joined processions of flagellants, whipping themselves bloody in public squares, hoping their suffering would appease God's wrath. They gave away their possessions, confessed sins they'd never committed, made pilgrimages to distant shrines. They prayed until their voices gave out, and then kept praying silently. Some turned to violence. They blamed outsiders, Jews, lepers, anyone who seemed different or suspicious. They burned houses, destroyed communities, murdered innocents. Fear made them cruel in ways they'd never imagined possible, but most people just tried to continue living. They got up each morning and tended their animals, prepared their meagre meals, said their prayers. They avoided crowds when they could, but they couldn't avoid their own families. They watched their children for signs of sickness, felt their own bodies for swellings, wondered if today would be the day the plague finally noticed them. The dead were buried in mass graves, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes without names. The traditional rituals of death, the wake, the procession, the proper burial in consecrated ground, became impossible when bodies were piling up faster than they could be properly handled. Priests died as quickly as anyone else, leaving communities without spiritual guidance just when they needed it most. And yet, somehow, life continued. People fell in love and married during plague years. Children were born and named and baptized. Crops were planted and harvested. Stories were told by firelight. Songs were sung to quiet, crying babies. The human capacity for hope, for normalcy, for continuing on despite everything, proved stronger than any disease. The survivors, when the plague finally passed, were different people than they had been before. They'd seen too much death, buried too many loved ones, lived too long with the constant awareness of mortality. They were quieter, more careful, more grateful for simple things like waking up healthy, sharing a meal, hearing a child laugh. They also had questions that their world couldn't answer. Why had some lived while others died? What did it mean that prayer hadn't saved the devout? That wealth hadn't protected the powerful? That age hadn't spared the young? The old certainties about God's justice, about the natural order of things, about the meaning of suffering, had been shaken by the sheer randomness of who survived and who didn't. But they rebuilt. They always rebuilt. They cleared the abandoned houses, replanted the empty fields, remarried, had new children. They developed new ways of understanding disease, new practices for dealing with outbreaks, new rituals for honoring the dead. They carried their losses with them, but they didn't let those losses stop them from living. The thing about medieval plagues is that they never really ended. They just retreated, like tides pulling back from the shore. The Black Death passed, but smaller outbreaks continued for centuries. Every generation had to learn again how to live with the possibility of sudden, inexplicable death. Every community had to develop its own ways of coping with loss that seemed too great to bear. And in the quiet moments, when the immediate crisis had passed and people could think about something other than survival, they told stories. Stories about the time before the sickness came. Stories about the people who didn't make it through. Stories about signs and wonders, about miraculous recoveries, about the strange ways that communities came together or fell apart under pressure. These stories weren't written down, mostly. They lived in memory, passed from one generation to the next, around fires that burned a little brighter because so many hearths had gone cold. They were stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, about the quiet heroism of simply continuing to care for each other when caring itself had become dangerous. The medieval world's relationship with plague was intimate and ongoing. It wasn't something that happened to other people in distant places. It was something that lived in your village, your family, your own body. It was the reason you said prayers before sleeping, the reason you held your children a little tighter, the reason you didn't make plans too far into the future. But it was also the reason you appreciated simple pleasures more deeply. The taste of fresh bread, the warmth of a fire, the sound of rain on thatch, the sight of green shoots pushing through soil. When you've lived with the constant possibility of loss, the things that remain become more precious, more worthy of attention, more cause for gratitude. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your warm bed, in your safe house, in your world where plague is mostly a memory from history books, remember those medieval people who faced the darkness with nothing but their faith, their stubborn hope, and their quiet determination to keep caring for each other no matter what. They didn't defeat the plague, but they outlasted it. But the Black Death was not just another plague. It was a catastrophe that redefined the very meaning of survival. When it arrived in European ports in 1347, carried by merchant ships from the east, it brought with it a horror that no amount of medieval suffering had prepared people for. This was not the familiar rhythm of seasonal illness, or the predictable cycle of hunger and recovery. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to mock every prayer, every remedy, every quiet hope that had sustained generations of peasants through their darkest hours. The disease announced itself with symptoms that defied understanding. Swellings the size of apples appeared in the groin and armpits, dark and tender, weeping blood and pus. Fever consumed the body from within, so intense that victims threw off their clothes even in winter, their skin burning to the touch. Black spots appeared on the flesh, spreading like spilled ink across arms and faces. The breath turned foul, the tongue swelled, and many victims began coughing blood that stained their lips and teeth a deep, unsettling red. But it was the speed that truly terrified. A person could wake feeling perfectly well, complain of a headache by midday, develop the telltale swellings by evening, and be dead before dawn. Families watched helplessly as fathers, mothers, and children succumbed within hours of each other. The careful rhythms of medieval life, built around the expectation that death would at least announce itself with some ceremony, collapsed entirely. Death had become sudden, random, and utterly without mercy. The villages that had seemed so permanent, so rooted in their ancient routines, began to empty. Not gradually, as they might during a harsh winter or a failed harvest, but with shocking swiftness. Entire families vanished within days. Houses stood with doors hanging open, meals still on the table, half-finished tasks abandoned forever. The careful social structures that had bound communities together for centuries simply dissolved. Who could maintain the old hierarchies when the lord of the manor lay dead beside his lowliest serf? The living faced impossible choices. Do you tend to the sick, knowing that proximity meant almost certain death? Do you flee, abandoning neighbors and family members to save yourself? Do you maintain the rituals of burial when there are too many bodies and too few hands to dig graves? Some tried to preserve the old ways, washing the dead, saying prayers, carrying bodies to consecrated ground. But as the death toll mounted, these customs became impossible to maintain. Bodies were thrown into hastily dug pits, sometimes still breathing, sometimes without any ceremony at all. The church, which had promised to guide souls through their final passage, found itself overwhelmed and helpless. Priests died as quickly as anyone else, their holy orders no protection against the disease. Entire monasteries were wiped out, their libraries and scriptoriums falling silent. The bells that had marked the rhythm of medieval life rang less frequently, then stopped altogether as there was no one left to pull the ropes. The very institution that had provided meaning and structure to peasant life seemed to have been abandoned by the god it claimed to serve. In some places, the social fabric didn't just fray, it tore completely. Desperate people turned to scapegoating, blaming Jews, lepers, or foreigners for bringing the plague. Entire communities were murdered by mobs seeking someone to punish for their suffering. Others turned to extreme religious fervor, forming processions of flagellants who whipped themselves bloody in public squares, believing that their suffering might appease God's wrath. The rational world that peasants had constructed, with its careful balance of obligation and survival, gave way to something much darker and more chaotic. Yet even in this apocalyptic landscape, the fundamental rhythms of human nature persisted. Some people revealed themselves to be capable of extraordinary compassion, staying to care for the sick even when it meant their own death. Others showed a different kind of courage, the simple determination to continue living, to plant crops and tend animals and raise children even when the world seemed to be ending. These were not grand gestures recorded in chronicles, but quiet acts of defiance against despair. The survivors, those who lived through the worst years of the plague, found themselves in a world that had been fundamentally altered. Entire villages had been abandoned, their fields returning to forest. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval life for centuries had been shattered. With so many dead, labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants who had never dared to question their place in the world found themselves able to demand better wages, better treatment, better lives. The very catastrophe that had seemed to destroy their world had also created new possibilities within it. But the psychological scars ran deeper than any social change. The survivors had seen their most fundamental assumptions about life, death, and divine justice called into question. They had watched children die while criminals lived. They had seen the pious and the wicked struck down with equal randomness. The careful theology that had explained suffering as part of God's plan seemed inadequate to explain a catastrophe of this magnitude. How do you maintain faith when prayer seems to go unanswered? When the church itself has proven powerless? When the very structure of the world has revealed itself to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined? The plague returned in waves, each outbreak bringing fresh terror to communities that had barely recovered from the last. The survivors learned to live with a new kind of uncertainty, knowing that the disease could return at any moment, that the careful lives they were rebuilding could be swept away again without warning. They developed new rituals, new ways of understanding their place in a world that had proven to be far more dangerous and unpredictable than their ancestors had ever imagined. Children born after the plague grew up in a world shaped by absence. They inherited empty houses, abandoned fields, and stories of a time when the world had been fuller, more crowded, more certain of itself. They learned to navigate a landscape marked by ruins and remembrance, where every village had its tales of the dead, every family its catalogue of losses. The plague had not just killed individuals, it had killed ways of life, entire cultures, the accumulated wisdom of generations. And yet, somehow, life continued. The survivors married, had children, planted crops, built new houses on the foundations of the old. They created new communities, new traditions, new ways of making sense of a world that had revealed itself to be far more fragile than they had ever imagined. The plague had been a catastrophe, but it had not been the end. It had been a transformation, violent and unwanted, but ultimately survivable. The medieval world that emerged from the plague was different from the one that had existed before. It was smaller, more uncertain, more aware of its own mortality, but it was also, in some ways, more human. The rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval life for centuries had been shaken, creating space for new forms of social organization, new ways of thinking about individual worth and collective responsibility. The plague had been a disaster, but it had also been a liberation, freeing survivors from assumptions and limitations that had constrained their ancestors for generations. In the end, the Black Death became part of the story that medieval communities told about themselves. It was the Great Divide, the moment when the old world ended and the new one began. The survivors carried its memory forward, not as a source of despair, but as a reminder of their own resilience, their ability to endure even the worst catastrophes and emerge, scarred but intact, on the other side. The plague had tested them in ways that no previous generation had been tested, and they had survived. The plague was not a visitor that knocked politely at your door. It was a thief in the night, slipping through cracks in shutters, travelling on the breath of strangers, hiding in the folds of cloth that had touched the dying. By the time you realized it had arrived, it was already too late to bar the gates or burn the bridges or pray it away. The sickness was inside your walls, inside your village, inside your very blood. We speak of the Black Death as if it were the first plague medieval Europe had ever seen, but that is the luxury of hindsight. Long before the great mortality of the 14th century carved its name into history, smaller plagues had been testing the endurance of peasant communities for generations. They came without fanfare, without chroniclers to record their passage, without monuments to mark their devastation. They simply arrived, killed, and moved on, leaving behind empty cottages and unmarked graves, and the quiet understanding that death was always closer than the next harvest. The plague, you knew, was not the dramatic, sweeping catastrophe that would later fill the pages of learned men's books. It was quieter, more intimate, more personal. It was the fever that took your neighbor's child in the night. It was the swelling that appeared on your sister's neck and grew larger each day until she could no longer swallow. It was the cough that started in the merchant's cart and spread through the village like wildfire through dry thatch, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a silence so complete it seemed to press against your ears. You learned to recognize the signs long before the word plague was whispered in the lanes. The way dogs would howl at nothing, the way birds would abandon their nests and fly in confused circles before dropping from the sky, the way the very air seemed to thicken, as if something invisible and malevolent was moving through it, tasting everything it touched. You learned to read the faces of travelers, to spot the telltale pallor, the way their eyes seemed to sink deeper into their skulls, the way they moved with the careful deliberation of those who were already dying but didn't yet know it. The sickness came in waves, each one different from the last. Sometimes it was a fever that burned through villages like a fire through stubble, leaving behind only ashes and memories. Sometimes it was a wasting disease that consumed people slowly, turning them into hollow-eyed shadows of themselves before finally claiming them. Sometimes it was something that attacked the lungs, filling them with fluid, until the dying drowned in their own blood while their families watched helplessly from across the room. But it was never random, never truly random. The plague had its preferences, its patterns, its cruel logic. It took the young and the old first, those whose bodies were already struggling against the daily hardships of medieval life. It took the poor before the rich, the hungry before the well-fed, the crowded before the isolated. It moved through the narrow lanes of villages like water finding its level, seeking out the weak, the vulnerable, the already half dead. You learned to live with it the way you learned to live with winter or famine, or the constant threat of war. Not because you accepted it, but because you had no choice. You learned to burn the clothes of the dead, to bury them quickly and without ceremony, to avoid the houses where the sickness had taken hold. You learned to recognize the smell of death before it arrived, to read the signs in the color of someone's skin, the sound of their breathing, the way they held their head when they thought no one was watching. The church offered explanations, of course. The plague was God's judgment, they said, a punishment for sin, a test of faith, a reminder of mortality. You were told to pray harder, to fast longer, to confess more thoroughly. You were told that the righteous would be spared, that the faithful would be protected, that those who died had somehow deserved their fate. But when the priest himself fell ill, when the bishop's own family was touched by the sickness, when the holy water and the blessed candles and the fragments of saints' bones proved powerless against the fever, you began to understand that the plague respected no boundaries, recognized no authority, honored no prayers. Some turned to other explanations. The plague was caused by bad air, they said, by the alignment of the planets, by the poisoning of wells, by the angry spirits of the dead. Some blamed the Jews, the lepers, the foreigners, anyone who was different, anyone who could be made to carry the weight of communal fear and rage. Violence followed in the plague's wake, not just the violence of the disease itself, but the violence of people who needed someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to kill in the hope that death might be satisfied and pass them by. But mostly you endured. You endured the way your ancestors had endured, the way your children would endure, with a kind of stubborn, wordless resilience that was perhaps humanity's greatest strength. You continued to plant your fields even when you weren't sure you would live to harvest them. You continued to mend your roof even when you weren't sure you would survive the winter. You continued to tell stories to your children even when you weren't sure they would live to tell them to their own children. The plague changed you, though. It changed the way you looked at your neighbors, the way you planned for the future, the way you understood your place in the world. It taught you that life was fragile, that death was arbitrary, that the distance between health and sickness was measured not in miles, but in heartbeats. It taught you to value the present moment, to find joy in small things, to hold your loved ones closer while you still could. And when the plague finally passed, when the fever broke and the swelling subsided and the cough faded into memory, you were left with a different kind of knowledge. You had looked death in the face and survived. You had walked through the valley of shadows and emerged on the other side, scarred but alive, changed but unbroken. You had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to continue living in spite of it. The empty cottages remained empty. The unmarked graves remained unmarked. The silence remained, deeper now, more permanent. But life continued, as it always had, as it always would. New children were born. New marriages were celebrated. New crops were planted. The wheel turned. The seasons changed. And the plague became just another story to tell around the fire on long winter nights. Another reminder that survival was its own form of victory. You never forgot, though. You never forgot the sound of the death bells ringing through the night, the sight of carts loaded with bodies, the smell of burning clothes and burning houses and burning hope. You never forgot the faces of those who didn't make it, the names that were never spoken again, the dreams that died with the dreamers. You carried them with you, not as a burden but as a responsibility, a reminder that you had been spared for a reason, that your survival meant something, that your story was worth telling. The plague taught you that life was precious precisely because it was fragile, that love was meaningful precisely because it was temporary, that hope was powerful precisely because it was so often tested. It taught you to live not in spite of death, but in full knowledge of it, to embrace each day not because it was guaranteed, but because it was a gift. And so you lived and loved and hoped and endured. You lived for those who couldn't, loved for those who wouldn't, hoped for those who had given up, endured for those who had fallen. You lived because life was the only revenge you could take against death, the only victory you could claim against the darkness, the only answer you could give to the question of why you had been spared, when so many others had not. The plague would come again, you knew. It always did. But you would be ready for it, not because you were stronger or braver or more deserving than those who had died, but because you had learned the most important lesson of all, that survival was not about avoiding death, but about refusing to let death define you. That courage was not about being unafraid, but about being afraid and choosing to live anyway. That hope was not about expecting the best, but about continuing to believe in the possibility of better, even when everything around you suggested otherwise. And in that stubborn, quiet, everyday refusal to surrender, you found something that the plague could never touch, something that death could never claim, something that would outlast the fever and the fear and the silence that followed. You found the unbreakable human spirit, the thing that made you more than just another victim, more than just another casualty, more than just another name forgotten by history. But the plague itself was just the beginning. The real horror lay in how it unraveled everything people thought they knew about survival, about community, about the very fabric of their small, predictable world. When the Black Death finally reached your village, it didn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrived quietly, carried by a merchant's cart or a pilgrim's cough, slipping through doors like cold wind through cracked timber. At first, it looked like any other illness. Someone took to their bed. Someone else developed a fever. Nothing unusual in a world where sickness was as common as rain. But this was different. This moved faster than anything anyone had seen before. The signs were unmistakable once you learned to recognize them. The swellings appeared first. Hard lumps in the neck, under the arms, in the groin. Buboes, they called them, though most people didn't know the word. They just knew that when those appeared, you started saying your prayers. The fever came next, burning through bodies like fire through dry thatch. People who had been working in the fields at dawn were delirious by sunset. Their skin turned dark, mottled with patches that looked like bruises but never healed. Some coughed blood. Others vomited until there was nothing left but bile and despair. Death came quickly for some, slowly for others. But it came, and it came for everyone. The young, the old, the strong, the weak. It didn't care if you were pious or sinful, rich or poor. It took the village priest as readily as it took the village drunk. It claimed mothers and left their infants crying. It stole children and left parents hollow-eyed and broken. The first few deaths were handled with the proper rituals. The priest came with his oils and his Latin. Families gathered. Candles were lit. Bodies were washed, wrapped and buried in the churchyard with the appropriate prayers. But as the disease spread, the rituals began to break down. There weren't enough priests. There wasn't enough time. There weren't enough people left to dig the graves. Bodies piled up in houses because no one was strong enough to carry them out. Families died together, huddled in their beds, leaving only silence behind. The church bell stopped ringing for the dead because there was no one left to pull the rope. The sound of digging stopped because the gravediggers themselves were in the ground. Fear changed everything. Neighbors who had shared tools and gossip for decades suddenly crossed the road to avoid each other. Parents abandoned sick children. Children fled from dying parents. The bonds that held communities together snapped like overstretched rope. Some turned to religion with desperate intensity. They prayed louder, longer, harder. They whipped themselves raw, believing that their suffering might appease whatever divine wrath had been unleashed. They saw the plague as God's judgment and sought to prove their worthiness through pain. Others turned to blame. It had to be someone's fault. The Jews, the foreigners, the beggars, the lepers. Anyone who looked different, spoke differently, or lived on the margins became a target. Villages that had coexisted peacefully for generations erupted in violence. Mobs formed, accusations flew, and blood was spilled in the name of purification. The economy collapsed, markets closed, trade stopped. Fields went unharvested because there was no one left to swing the scythe. Livestock wandered free, lowing pitifully for owners who would never come home. Money became meaningless when there was nothing left to buy and no one left to sell it. But perhaps the most terrifying thing was the silence. Villages that had hummed with life, with arguments and laughter, and the everyday sounds of human existence went quiet. The only sounds were the wind through empty houses and the occasional cry of a crow or the howl of a wolf growing bold enough to venture into abandoned settlements. Those who survived did so by luck more than wisdom. Some fled to the forests and lived like animals. Others barricaded themselves in their homes and waited. A few seemed naturally resistant, nursing the sick and burying the dead without ever falling ill themselves. They became the inheritors of a broken world. When the plague finally moved on, as plagues do, it left behind landscapes of devastation. Entire villages stood empty, fields returned to wilderness. Churches crumbled without congregations to maintain them. The survivors wandered through the ruins of their former lives like ghosts, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. The social order that had seemed so permanent, so inevitable, lay in ruins. Serfs found themselves free not through liberation, but through the simple fact that their lords were dead. Priests discovered empty churches. Merchants found no one left to trade with. The careful hierarchies that had governed medieval life for centuries dissolved in the face of universal mortality. Yet somehow, impossibly, life continued. The survivors buried their dead, cleaned their houses, and began again. They married quickly, had children frantically, as if trying to replace what had been lost. They told stories about the time before, when the world was full of people, when every house had smoke rising from its chimney, when the church bells rang for joy as often as for sorrow. They adapted because they had to. They created new communities from the fragments of the old. They developed new customs, new ways of remembering, new methods of survival. They learned to live with the knowledge that everything they thought was permanent could disappear in a season, that the future was never guaranteed, that death was always closer than they wanted to believe. The plague passed, but it left its mark on everything, on the survivors who carried the memory of loss like a scar, on the landscape dotted with abandoned villages and overgrown fields, on the very conception of what it meant to be human, to be mortal, to be part of something larger than oneself. They learned that survival wasn't about being strong or smart or good. It was about being lucky. And they learned that even in the darkest times, when it seemed like the world was ending, people found ways to keep going, not because they were brave or noble, but because stopping meant giving up on tomorrow. And tomorrow, however uncertain, was still worth living for. The medieval world that emerged from the plague was different from the one that had existed before, more fragile perhaps, but also more resilient, more aware of its own mortality, but also more determined to make the most of whatever time remained. The survivors carried forward not just their own lives, but the memory of all those who had been lost. They became the guardians of a world that had almost ended, the keepers of stories that might otherwise have been forgotten. And in their persistence, in their refusal to let the plague have the final word, they achieved something remarkable. They survived not just the disease, but the collapse of everything they had known. They rebuilt not just their villages, but their faith in the possibility of continuation. They proved that even in the face of apocalypse, the human spirit could endure. The plague was a teacher as well as a destroyer. It taught them that life was precious precisely because it was fragile, that communities were valuable because they could be lost, that the future was worth fighting for because it was never guaranteed. These were harsh lessons, paid for with unimaginable suffering. But the plague changed everything. It didn't just kill people, it killed the very fabric of medieval society. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, it arrived like a terrible teacher, one that didn't ask permission and didn't accept excuses. It taught lessons that no one wanted to learn, but everyone had to live with. The plague didn't discriminate. It took the young and the old, the pious and the sinful, the rich and the poor. But it was the poor who suffered most, because they always did. They lived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions where disease spread fastest. They couldn't flee to country estates or lock themselves away in stone towers. They had to keep working, keep moving, keep trying to survive even as death stalked through their villages like a hungry wolf. When the plague came to a village, it didn't announce itself with fanfare. It crept in quietly, perhaps carried by a merchant's cart or a traveling priest. Someone would start coughing, develop a fever, complain of aches. Within days, the telltale signs would appear. The buboes, those horrific swellings in the neck, armpits, and groin. The blackening of fingers and toes. The delirium that made people cry out in languages no one recognized. The smell came next. The sweet, cloying stench of death that seemed to seep into everything. It clung to clothes, to walls, to the very air itself. You couldn't escape it. You couldn't wash it away. It became part of the landscape, as familiar as the scent of bread or the sound of church bells. People tried everything to ward off the plague. They burned aromatic herbs, carried posies of flowers, wore masks stuffed with spices. They prayed harder than they ever had before. They confessed sins they'd forgotten they'd committed. They made pilgrimages to distant shrines, hoping that suffering would earn them salvation. But the plague didn't care about their prayers or their penance. It took them anyway. The social order that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, began to crumble. There weren't enough living to bury the dead. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in mass graves, blessed hastily by priests who might themselves be dead within the week. The church, that great pillar of medieval life, found itself powerless against an enemy it couldn't explain or defeat. Some turned to extreme measures. The flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. They believed that by inflicting pain on themselves, they could appease God's wrath. Others turned to violence, seeking scapegoats for their suffering. Jews were blamed and massacred. Foreigners were driven out. Anyone who seemed different became a target. But perhaps the most profound change was in the way people thought about life itself. The plague taught them that death could come at any moment, without warning, without mercy. It made them acutely aware of their mortality in a way that previous generations had never been. Life became more precious because it was so obviously fragile. The survivors emerged changed. They had seen things that would haunt them forever. They had watched their children die, their spouses waste away, their neighbors disappear one by one. They had learned to live with loss in ways that seemed impossible before the plague arrived. They developed a kind of resilience that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Those who lived through the plague carried its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. They hoarded food more carefully, knowing how quickly abundance could turn to scarcity. They held their loved ones closer, knowing how easily they could be taken away. They found meaning in small moments, in quiet joys, in the simple act of waking up each morning to discover they were still alive. The plague also created opportunities that hadn't existed before. With so many dead, there was suddenly a shortage of workers. Surviving peasants could demand higher wages, better conditions, more freedom. The rigid social hierarchy that had defined medieval life began to show cracks. Some serfs bought their freedom. Some peasants moved to cities where they could start new lives. The old certainties were gone, and in their place came a kind of cautious hope. But the scars remained. In the way people flinched when someone coughed, in the way they crossed themselves when passing a graveyard, in the way they treasured each harvest, each birth, each day without tragedy. The plague had taught them that survival was not a right, but a gift, one that could be revoked at any moment. The medieval world that emerged from the plague was different from the one that had entered it. It was smaller, sadder, more fragile, but it was also more human in some ways. People had learned to value life precisely because they had seen how easily it could be lost. They had discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. They had found ways to love and hope and laugh even in the shadow of death. The plague didn't end medieval society, but it transformed it. It taught people that the world was not as stable as they had believed, that change was not only possible but inevitable. It planted seeds of doubt about old certainties, old hierarchies, old ways of understanding the world, and from those seeds would eventually grow new ideas, new possibilities, new ways of being human. In the end, the plague was both destroyer and creator. It took away the old world, with all its certainties and constraints. But it also opened up space for something new to grow. The people who survived it were forever changed, marked by their encounter with mortality. But that brutal legacy was only the beginning. The medieval world had grown accustomed to suffering, but the plague's aftermath created wounds that would fester for generations. Villages that had once bustled with life now stood as monuments to emptiness, their fields returning to wilderness, their churches echoing with prayers for the dead who outnumbered the living. In the wake of the Black Death, those who remained faced a world turned upside down. The rigid social order that had bound peasants to their lords for centuries began to crack under the weight of necessity. With so many dead, labor became precious. Survivors found themselves with bargaining power they had never possessed before. A peasant who had once begged for scraps could now demand wages, better conditions, even choose which lord to serve. But this newfound freedom came with a price. The old certainties were gone. The church, which had promised divine protection, struggled to explain why God had allowed such devastation. Priests who had survived watched their congregations dwindle, their authority questioned by people who had seen prayers go unanswered and holy water fail to heal. The very foundations of faith trembled. Social tensions that had simmered for generations now boiled over. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was perhaps the most dramatic example, but similar uprisings erupted across Europe. These were not the desperate raids of starving people, but organized rebellions led by survivors who had tasted freedom and would not easily surrender it. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair wages, and the right to move freely. Some even dared to question the divine right of kings. The response was swift and brutal. The ruling classes, terrified of losing their grip on power, crushed these revolts with overwhelming force. Leaders were executed, participants were hunted down, and the old order was reimposed with iron determination. Yet something fundamental had changed. The seeds of social transformation had been planted in the charnel houses of the plague years. Economic structures that had endured for centuries began to shift. The manorial system, built on an abundance of cheap labor, could no longer function when workers were scarce. Land that had been carefully tended for generations lay fallow, forcing lords to offer incentives to attract tenants. Some peasants accumulated multiple holdings, becoming prosperous farmers in their own right. Others abandoned agriculture entirely, flocking to towns where craftsmen and merchants offered new opportunities. The plague also accelerated changes that had been slowly developing for decades. The growth of towns, the expansion of trade, the rise of a money economy, all gained momentum in the post-plague world. Survivors had inheritances from multiple relatives, creating concentrations of wealth that would have been impossible before. Some invested in land, others in trade, still others in the new technologies that were beginning to reshape medieval life. Yet for all these changes, the fundamental brutality of medieval existence remained. The plague had not created a more just world, merely a different one. The poor were still poor, the powerful still powerful. What had changed was the relationship between them. The old bonds of feudal obligation, weakened by death and disruption, were being replaced by new forms of economic dependence. The peasant who had once owed his lord 3 days of labor per week now paid rent in silver, but the silver was often harder to come by than the labor had been. The psychological impact of living through such devastation cannot be overstated. Survivors developed a peculiar relationship with death, neither fearing it as their ancestors had, nor welcoming it as their descendants might. They had seen it come for rich and poor alike, for the pious and the wicked, for the young and the old. Death had revealed itself as arbitrary, capricious, utterly beyond human control or understanding. This realization bred both despair and a strange kind of liberation. If death could come at any moment, then life had to be lived with greater intensity. The danse macabre, that haunting artistic motif showing death dancing with people of all stations, became a common theme in post-plague art. It was both a reminder of mortality and a celebration of the democracy of death. Religious practices evolved to accommodate this new reality. The cult of the saints expanded as people sought intercessors who might understand their specific sufferings. New prayers were composed, new rituals developed, all attempting to make sense of a world where divine justice seemed absent. Some turned to mysticism, seeking direct contact with the divine that bypassed the corrupted earthly church. Others embraced a more practical faith, one that emphasized good works and community support over theological speculation. The plague also reshaped the landscape of medieval Europe in ways that would persist for centuries. Abandoned villages became overgrown ruins, their stones eventually recycled for new construction. Forests reclaimed fields that had been cultivated since Roman times. Wildlife populations, freed from human pressure, began to recover. In some regions, wolves returned to areas where they had been extinct for generations. These ecological changes had profound social implications. The return of wilderness meant the return of danger, but also opportunity. Hunting, once the exclusive privilege of the nobility, became a necessity for survival. Poaching laws were harder to enforce when there were fewer people to enforce them. The boundaries between civilization and wilderness, so carefully maintained in the high medieval period, began to blur. Knowledge, too, was transformed by the plague's aftermath. The death of so many learned men, particularly in the monasteries, created gaps in institutional memory that would never be fully filled. Manuscripts were lost, techniques forgotten, traditions broken. Yet this destruction also created opportunities for innovation. New ideas could take root in the fertile soil of disruption, unencumbered by the weight of established authority. The printing press, invented in the century following the Black Death, was perhaps the most dramatic example of this transformation. The technology might have been developed earlier, but the social conditions that made it profitable, the demand for books created by an increasingly literate population, the breakdown of scribal monopolies, all were products of the post-plague world. Women, too, found their positions altered by the demographic catastrophe. With so many men dead, women inherited property, managed businesses, and exercised authority in ways that would have been unthinkable in the pre-plague world. Some religious houses, depleted of male clergy, were effectively run by women. Widows, common in a world where plague had claimed husbands and sons, developed new forms of economic and social independence. Yet this liberation was fragile and often temporary. As populations recovered and social structures stabilized, women were often pushed back into traditional roles. The brief window of opportunity created by demographic collapse closed as quickly as it had opened. Still, the memory of what was possible remained, influencing later generations who would face their own crises and opportunities. The Plague Years also saw the emergence of new forms of cultural expression. Art became more realistic, more concerned with depicting the human condition in all its frailty. Literature grew darker, more psychologically complex. The courtly romances of the high medieval period gave way to works that grappled with mortality, suffering, and the arbitrary nature of existence. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, with their frank examination of human nature, could only have been written by someone who had lived through the Plague Years. Music, too, was transformed. The elaborate polyphony of the medieval church gave way to simpler forms that could be performed by smaller groups. Secular music gained prominence as traditional religious forms seemed inadequate to express the new realities of existence. The haunting melodies of the Plague Years, with their mixture of beauty and melancholy, would influence European music for centuries to come. Perhaps most importantly, the plague created a new sense of European identity. The disease had crossed all borders, affected all peoples, created a shared experience of suffering that transcended local loyalties. Survivors recognized that they were part of something larger than their village, their region, their kingdom. This recognition would eventually contribute to the development of humanism, with its emphasis on shared human experience and dignity. The medical profession, such as it was, emerged from the Plague Years chastened but also transformed. The traditional authorities, Galen and Avicenna, had proven inadequate to the challenge of epidemic disease. New approaches were needed, new forms of observation and treatment. The foundations of empirical medicine were laid in the charnel houses of the Plague Years, built on the recognition that traditional knowledge was not sufficient to understand or treat the human condition. Yet for all these transformations, the fundamental structures of medieval life persisted. The church, though weakened, remained the dominant institution. The nobility, though challenged, retained their power. The peasantry, though more mobile, remained dependent on the land. The plague had not created a new world so much as revealed the possibilities that had always existed within the old one. The memory of the Plague Years would haunt Europe for generations. Children who had never known the disease grew up with stories of the time when death walked the earth. These stories shaped their understanding of existence, their relationship with authority, their expectations of the future. The plague became a benchmark against which all other disasters were measured, a reminder that civilization was more fragile than it appeared. In the end, the legacy of medieval plagues was not simply death and destruction, but transformation. The world that emerged from the Plague Years was recognizably different from the one that had entered them. Not better, necessarily, but different. The bonds that had held medieval society together for centuries had been stretched, some to the breaking point. New forms of organization, new ways of thinking, new relationships between individuals and institutions, all emerged from the crucible of epidemic disease. The peasants who survived the Plague Years were not the same people who had entered them. They had seen too much, lost too much, endured too much to remain unchanged. They carried within them the knowledge that the world could end, that everything they had known could disappear in a matter of months. This knowledge was both terrifying and liberating. It freed them from some of the constraints of tradition, while burdening them with new responsibilities and uncertainties. And in the quiet moments, when the work was done and the fire burned low, they remembered. They remembered the faces of the dead, the the sound of church bells tolling endlessly, the smell of burning bodies, the silence that followed the storm. They remembered, and in remembering, they honoured both the dead and the living. For they had endured, and in enduring, they had proven that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit could not be entirely extinguished. The dark history of medieval plagues was not just a story of death, but of survival. Not just of destruction, but of renewal. Not just of endings, but of beginnings. The world that emerged from the plague years would face new challenges, new opportunities, new possibilities. The plague was never just about death. It was about the slow unraveling of everything that held the world together. By the time we reach this point in our story, the Black Death has already swept through Europe like a terrible tide, leaving behind not just bodies, but the fragments of a civilization that had once seemed unshakable. What came next wasn't rebuilding. It was something far more complex. A world learning to live with the knowledge that everything could disappear in a matter of months. The survivors didn't wake up one morning and decide to start over. They woke up to silence. Villages where the church bells no longer rang because there was no one left to pull the ropes. Fields that stretched empty under the same sun that had once watched over bustling harvests. The plague had taken more than lives. It had taken the assumption that tomorrow would look like today, that the old ways would continue, that the world had rules that could be counted on. In the aftermath, the living found themselves in a strange position. For the first time in generations, there were more resources than people to use them. Empty houses stood with their doors ajar, waiting for occupants who would never return. Tools lay unused in workshops. Livestock wandered without herders. The rigid hierarchy that had defined every aspect of medieval life suddenly had gaps that couldn't be filled by simply promoting the next person in line. Because often, there was no next person. This wasn't liberation in any sense that felt triumphant. It was more like standing in the ruins of a collapsed building, holding a key to a door that no longer existed. The survivors had to figure out not just how to live, but how to live in a world where the old certainties had been proven catastrophically wrong. The manor system that had bound peasants to their land for centuries began to crack when there simply weren't enough peasants left to work the fields. Lords who had once commanded dozens of families found themselves begging labourers to stay, offering wages instead of demanding service. The church, which had promised protection and meaning, struggled to explain why the faithful had died alongside the sinful, why prayers had gone unanswered, why the righteous had suffered just as much as anyone else. The survivors didn't lose their faith entirely, but they held it differently now, with more questions and fewer easy answers. The plague had been democratic in its destruction. It took the pious and the wicked, the young and the old, the rich and the poor. But it wasn't quite equal in its aftermath. Those who survived found themselves in a world where scarcity had been replaced by a different kind of abundance. There were fields to be claimed, houses to be occupied, opportunities that had never existed before. But there was also a profound loneliness that came from being among the remnant. Survivors often spoke of dreams filled with voices of the dead, not ghost stories, but the simple, haunting presence of all the conversations that would never happen, all the hands that would never help with the harvest, all the children who would never grow up to continue the endless cycle of planting and reaping that had defined rural life for centuries. The world had become larger and smaller at the same time. Larger because there was more space, more possibility. Smaller because there were fewer people to share it with. The economic changes were swift and dramatic. With so many dead, the survivors found themselves in a position their grandparents could never have imagined. They could demand wages. They could choose where to work. They could leave one lord for another who offered better conditions. The old laws that had bound them to the land became increasingly difficult to enforce when there were more laws than people to be bound by them. But freedom, when it came, was complicated. It came with the burden of choice, and choice required knowledge that had been kept from peasants for generations. How do you negotiate a wage when you've never been paid for your labor? How do you choose between opportunities when you've never had options? How do you plan for the future when the recent past has taught you that the future is fundamentally unpredictable? Some survivors thrived in this new world. They accumulated land, married into empty holdings, built wealth that their families had never dreamed of. They became the ancestors of a new middle class, people who weren't nobility but weren't peasants either. They were something new, something that the old world hadn't had a name for. Others found the weight of possibility crushing. They had spent their lives learning to endure, not to choose. Freedom felt less like liberation and more like being lost. The plague had also changed the relationship between the living and the dead. Death, which had always been a presence in medieval life, became something different after the mass mortalities. It wasn't just the natural end of life anymore. It was a reminder of how quickly everything could change, how little control anyone really had. The survivors developed new rituals, new ways of honoring not just individual deaths, but the collective loss of an entire way of life. They told stories differently now. The old tales of heroes and villains, of clear moral lessons and predictable outcomes, felt naive in a world that had seen entire communities vanish. The stories that survived were more complex, more ambiguous. They spoke of endurance rather than triumph, of surviving rather than conquering. They were stories for people who had learned that the world was more fragile than they had been taught. The church, meanwhile, struggled to maintain its authority in a world where its explanations had proven inadequate. The priests who survived found themselves ministering to congregations that had hard questions and weren't satisfied with easy answers. Why had God allowed this to happen? Why had the righteous suffered? What was the meaning of survival when so many others had died? Some found new forms of faith, more personal and less institutional. Others turned away from religion entirely, finding meaning in the simple act of continuing to live, to work, to build something from the wreckage. The church adapted, as institutions do, but it was never quite the same. The unquestioning obedience that had characterized medieval Christianity gave way to something more complex, more individual. The survivors also had to learn new ways of organizing society. The old feudal system, based on personal relationships and hereditary obligations, couldn't function when half the people in those relationships were dead. New forms of governance emerged, based more on negotiation and agreement than on tradition and birthright. It wasn't democracy as we would recognize it, but it was something different from what had come before. Villages that had been ruled by custom and tradition found themselves making decisions collectively, not because they believed in democratic principles, but because there was no one person with the authority to make decisions alone. The survivors learned to argue, to debate, to compromise. They developed new skills that their ancestors had never needed. The plague had also changed the relationship between town and country. With so many rural workers dead, the survivors found themselves drawn to towns and cities where there were more opportunities and more people. This migration wasn't just about economics. It was about the very human need for community, for the presence of others who had shared the experience of survival. The cities that emerged from the plague were different from those that had existed before. They were more fluid, more open to newcomers, more willing to adapt. The old guild systems that had controlled urban trades found themselves competing with newcomers who brought different skills and different ideas. Innovation flourished, not because people were more creative, but because the old ways of doing things had died along with the people who had maintained them. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about time. Before the plague, time had been cyclical. The seasons turned, the generations passed, and life continued in patterns that seemed eternal. After the plague, time felt more linear, more uncertain. The future was no longer a continuation of the past. It was something that had to be created, something that required active choice and effort. The survivors lived with a new consciousness of mortality, not just their own, but the mortality of their entire way of life. They had seen that civilizations could die, that ways of life that had seemed permanent could disappear in a single generation. This knowledge was both terrifying and liberating. It meant that nothing was guaranteed, but it also meant that everything was possible. They built differently, planned differently, loved differently. They were more aware of the preciousness of what they had, more conscious of how quickly it could be lost. They valued the present in ways their ancestors hadn't needed to, because they had learned that the present was all anyone really had. The world that emerged from the plague wasn't better or worse than what had come before. It was different. It was a world that had learned to live with uncertainty, to build meaning from the knowledge that everything was temporary. It was a world that had discovered that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about creating something new from the pieces of what had been destroyed. The plague had ended, but its lessons continued. The survivors and their children and their children's children carried forward not just the memory of what had been lost, but the knowledge of what was possible when the old certainties fell away. They had learned that the world could be remade, that people could adapt, that life could continue even after everything familiar had disappeared. In the end, the plague was a teacher as much as a destroyer. It taught that nothing was permanent, that everything was connected, that the individual life was both infinitely precious and ultimately fragile. These were hard lessons, paid for with unimaginable suffering. But they were also the foundation of a new kind of wisdom, a new way of being human in a world that had revealed its true nature. The survivors carried this wisdom forward, not as a burden, but as a gift. The invisible enemy was everywhere, in the water you drank, the air you breathed, the very soil beneath your feet. Disease moved through medieval villages like a whispered secret, touching some and sparing others according to no logic anyone could understand. And long before the great plagues that would carve their names into history, smaller pestilences were already teaching people the bitter mathematics of survival. You learned to recognize the signs early. The way someone's eyes would lose their brightness overnight, how a child's laughter would turn to silence, the particular quality of a cough that meant you should step back, cross yourself, and pray it wouldn't follow you home. Because in the medieval world, sickness wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a constant companion, patient and persistent, always ready to remind you that the line between health and death was thinner than parchment. The diseases came in waves, each one carrying its own signature of suffering. Some announced themselves with dramatic flourishes, fever that burned so hot it seemed to cook you from within, swellings that appeared overnight like grotesque fruits ripening under the skin, blood that darkened and thickened until it moved like tar through your veins. Others crept in quietly, stealing your strength one breath at a time, leaving you hollow and brittle as autumn leaves. And then there were the plagues that painted themselves across entire landscapes. The ones that didn't just claim individuals, but whole families, whole streets, whole villages. These were the diseases that rewrote the very fabric of society, leaving gaps in the world that would never quite heal. They moved faster than rumor, deadlier than war, more thorough than any army ever dreamed of being. The Black Death, when it finally arrived, was not the first of these invisible conquerors. It was simply the most complete, a master of its craft, honed by centuries of practice on smaller stages. It understood human nature better than humans understood themselves. It knew that people would flee, carrying the seeds of their own destruction. It knew that the wealthy would lock themselves away, only to find that walls couldn't stop something that travelled in the very air they breathed. But even before that great dying, communities had learned to live with the constant threat of epidemic. They developed rituals around it, superstitions that felt like armor against the incomprehensible. They learned to read the signs in the sky, in the behavior of animals, in the patterns of wind and weather. They created elaborate explanations for why some lived and others died, because random suffering was too terrible to contemplate. The wise women and village healers became experts in the art of hopeful deception. They offered remedies that couldn't cure but might comfort, herbs that did nothing but smell pleasant, prayers that held back despair if not disease, charms and amulets that protected the spirit even when they couldn't protect the body. They understood that sometimes the medicine that mattered most was the medicine that let people believe they had some control over their fate. And in the spaces between epidemics, in the quiet months when death seemed to sleep, communities would rebuild. Not just their populations, but their faith in tomorrow. They would plant crops with hands that had buried children. They would sing songs that had been silenced by fever. They would tell stories that kept the memory of the lost alive while making room for new hope to grow. The diseases taught harsh lessons about the fragility of human plans, about how quickly prosperity could turn to famine, celebration to mourning, certainty to chaos. They reminded everyone that the future was not a promise but a possibility, earned one day at a time through vigilance, luck, and the kind of stubborn determination that refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. Some villages developed their own ways of fighting back. They would isolate the sick, not from cruelty, but from a desperate mathematics of survival. They would burn the possessions of the dead, not from superstition, but from hard-won wisdom about how disease lingered in familiar objects. They would change their burial practices, their market days, their patterns of travel, anything that might give them an edge against an enemy they couldn't see or fully understand. The church offered its own explanations, its own remedies, mass prayers that brought communities together even as they risked spreading contagion, processions that were both acts of faith and potential death marches, relics that promised protection to those who touched them, even as they passed from hand to hand like vectors of transmission. The clergy died alongside their flocks, their Latin prayers no more effective than the folk remedies they officially condemned. And through it all, ordinary people continued the work of living. They married in the shadow of plague, knowing their unions might be measured in months rather than years. They had children despite the knowledge that many would not survive to adulthood. They built homes that might become tombs, planted gardens that might feed only the crows, made plans that might be ended by the next fever that wandered through their village. The diseases changed the very rhythm of medieval life. They made every gathering a risk, every stranger a potential carrier of death. They turned the natural human impulse toward community into a calculated gamble. They taught people to love with one hand while keeping the other ready to let go, because attachment in a world of epidemic was both essential and dangerous. But perhaps most remarkably, they also taught resilience, the kind of deep, quiet strength that could absorb loss after loss without breaking entirely, the ability to mourn the dead while caring for the living, the capacity to rebuild from ruins not once but again and again, each time with the full knowledge that the next collapse might be just around the corner. In the end, the great plagues of the medieval world were more than just medical catastrophes. They were tests of everything that made communities human. They stripped away the comfortable illusions about progress and permanence, revealing the raw truth that survival was never guaranteed, that every day of health was a gift that could be withdrawn without warning. And yet people endured. They found ways to laugh in the face of mortality, to create beauty in the midst of decay, to pass on knowledge and love and hope, even when the future seemed uncertain. They learned that the most powerful medicine was not any herb or prayer, but the simple decision to continue, to get up each morning and tend the fire, feed the animals, care for the sick, and believe that tomorrow might be different. The invisible enemies never truly departed. They simply retreated to the margins, waiting for the next opportunity to remind humanity of its vulnerability. The great plagues that swept through medieval Europe didn't just kill bodies. They murdered entire ways of life, entire systems of meaning, entire worlds of understanding. By the time the Black Death had run its course, the survivors weren't just people who had avoided infection. They were witnesses to the collapse of everything they thought they knew about how the world worked. The Church, that great organizing principle of medieval life, had promised that suffering had meaning, that obedience brought protection, that the righteous would be spared. But plague didn't read scripture. It didn't check baptismal records. It took the devout and the sinful with equal enthusiasm. Priests died blessing the sick. Bishops perished in their palaces. Entire monasteries fell silent, their bells no longer marking the hours because there was no one left to ring them. This wasn't just theological crisis. It was existential collapse. The framework that had held medieval society together, that had explained why some suffered and others prospered, why some ruled and others served, simply disintegrated. If God's representatives could die screaming in agony, what did that say about divine justice? If prayer couldn't stop the pestilence, what was the point of prayer at all? The feudal system, already strained by centuries of exploitation, began to crack under the pressure. Lords who had demanded absolute obedience found themselves begging peasants to work their fields. The survivors, those who had watched their families die while their betters fled to distant estates, began to ask dangerous questions. Why should they accept starvation wages when workers were scarce? Why should they bow to masters who had abandoned them in their hour of greatest need? Labor became valuable in ways it had never been before. A peasant who could plough a field, a craftsman who could work leather, a woman who could tend the sick. These people suddenly found themselves with something previous generations had never possessed: leverage. They could demand better conditions, higher wages, more freedom. And when the old authorities tried to reimpose the old restrictions, the survivors resisted with a fury born of loss and betrayal. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 wasn't just about taxes or wages. It was about people who had seen death take everyone, equally demanding that life treat them with equal dignity. They had buried lords and servants in the same mass graves, had watched the mighty fall as quickly as the meek. The artificial hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as the seasons suddenly looked fragile, temporary, almost absurd. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people understood mortality itself. Before the Great Plagues, death had been predictable, ritualized, meaningful. The old died, the sick died, the unlucky died. There were patterns, explanations, comfort in the familiar rhythms of loss. The plague destroyed all of that. It made death random, meaningless, terrifyingly democratic. This created a new kind of consciousness, a new way of being in the world. People began to live with an awareness of fragility that penetrated everything. They built their houses a little differently, stored their grain a little more carefully, loved their children a little more desperately. They developed what we might call a survivor's mentality, a constant calculation of risk and preparation for loss. The art changed too. Before the plague, medieval art had been about eternal things, about heaven and hell, about the unchanging truths of faith. After the plague, art became obsessed with death, with the temporary nature of all earthly things. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a common motif. Skeletons danced with kings and peasants alike, reminding viewers that all human distinctions were temporary, that death was the great equalizer. Literature began to focus on individual experience rather than universal truths. The stories that survived weren't just about saints and heroes anymore. They were about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, about how regular human beings responded to crisis, about the small acts of courage and kindness that kept communities alive when everything else was falling apart. Even the economy transformed. The old agricultural system, based on vast estates worked by bound labourers, began to give way to smaller holdings, wage labour and market relationships. Money became more important than land, skills more valuable than bloodlines. The survivors of the plague created the foundations of what would eventually become the modern economy. But perhaps most importantly, the plague survivors developed a new relationship with uncertainty. They learned to live with the knowledge that everything could change overnight, that the most careful plans could be destroyed by forces beyond human control. This wasn't despair exactly. It was a kind of realistic acceptance, a recognition that life was inherently precarious and that the only rational response was to find meaning in the present moment. They became experts at adaptation, at finding new ways to organize society when the old ways failed. They learned to value flexibility over tradition, innovation over precedent. They discovered that human beings were far more resilient than anyone had imagined, that communities could rebuild themselves from almost nothing, that hope could survive even the most devastating losses. The world that emerged from the Great Plagues wasn't the same world that had existed before. It was smaller in some ways, more local, more focused on immediate relationships and tangible realities. But it was also more human, more aware of its own mortality, more appreciative of the simple fact of survival. The survivors had learned something their ancestors had never known, that civilization itself was fragile, that it had to be actively maintained, that it could disappear if people stopped caring for it. This knowledge, born from catastrophe, shaped everything that came after. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, all of these movements were driven by people who had inherited the survivor's mentality, who understood that the world could be remade because they had seen it unmade. The plague survivors had discovered that human beings were capable of enduring almost anything, and that knowledge became the foundation of the modern world. They didn't just survive the plague. They survived the collapse of everything they had believed about how the world worked. And in doing so, they created new ways of believing, new ways of organizing society, new ways of being human. Their legacy wasn't just in the institutions they built or the art they created. It was in the recognition that human beings are fundamentally resilient, that communities can be rebuilt, that life can continue even after the most devastating losses. The Great Plagues of medieval Europe killed millions, but they also revealed something essential about human nature, that we are survivors, that we can adapt to almost anything, that we can find meaning and purpose even in the midst of catastrophe. The survivors of the plague carried this knowledge forward, and it became part of the foundation of everything that followed. Medieval plagues had left deep scars on the world, but their true legacy wasn't just in the empty villages or abandoned fields. It was in the fundamental shift in how people understood themselves and their place in a universe that seemed both cruel and indifferent. The survivors of the Great Dying emerged into a world where old certainties had crumbled, where the very foundations of social order had been shaken to their core. In the aftermath of plague, the survivors found themselves living in a world that operated by different rules. The rigid hierarchies that had once seemed as permanent as stone began to crack and shift. Peasants who had survived the dying found themselves in possession of something they had never known before: leverage. With so many dead, labor had become scarce, and scarcity meant power. For the first time in generations, those who worked the land could make demands, could negotiate, could say no and mean it. The lords who had once commanded absolute obedience now found themselves competing for workers. Wages rose, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. Serfs abandoned their traditional obligations and fled to places where they could sell their labor to the highest bidder. The very concept of being bound to the land began to dissolve, not through revolution, but through the simple arithmetic of survival. If half the population was dead, the other half suddenly mattered in ways they never had before. But this transformation came at a cost that defied calculation. The social fabric that had held communities together for centuries had been torn apart. Villages that had existed since time immemorial stood empty, their fields returning to wilderness. Churches fell silent, their congregations buried in mass graves. The oral traditions that had passed knowledge from one generation to the next were broken, leaving gaps in understanding that would never be filled. The church, which had promised protection and meaning, found its authority profoundly shaken. How could a just God allow such suffering? How could prayer and penance fail so completely? The priests who had confidently explained divine will found themselves struggling to make sense of a catastrophe that seemed to strike the righteous and the wicked with equal fury. Some turned to ever more extreme forms of penance, believing that the plague was punishment for humanity's sins. Others quietly questioned whether the God they had served was as benevolent as they had been taught. This spiritual crisis rippled through every aspect of medieval life. The art that emerged from the post-plague world was darker, more obsessed with death and judgment. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a common motif, depicting death as the great equalizer who came for king and peasant alike. These images weren't just artistic expressions. They were attempts to make sense of a world where traditional explanations had failed so spectacularly. The economy, too, was fundamentally altered. The careful balance between population and resources that had characterized medieval life was destroyed. In some regions, there was suddenly more land than people to work it. In others, the loss of skilled craftsmen and merchants disrupted trade networks that had taken centuries to develop. Entire industries collapsed overnight, while others found themselves in desperate need of workers. Yet perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about the future. The medieval worldview had been built on the assumption of continuity, that the world of the children would be much like the world of the parents. The plague shattered that assumption. Survivors learned to live with uncertainty, to plan for possibilities they had never imagined. The very concept of progress, of the idea that things could and should change, began to take root in soil, fertilized by catastrophe. The survivors developed a different relationship with death. Where once it had been seen as a distant possibility, carefully managed through ritual and tradition, it now became an intimate companion. People learned to live with the knowledge that everything could end without warning, that the strongest could fall as easily as the weakest. This awareness didn't paralyze them. Instead, it liberated them from some of the constraints that had previously governed their lives. Marriage patterns changed as families sought to rebuild their lines. Young people found themselves inheriting property and responsibilities far earlier than tradition had dictated. Women, particularly those who had survived when their husbands had not, discovered that necessity could override custom. Widows ran businesses, managed estates, and made decisions that would have been unthinkable in the old world. The knowledge that had been carefully guarded by various guilds and institutions was suddenly scattered. With so many masters dead, apprentices found themselves promoted to positions they weren't prepared for. Secrets that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen were lost forever. But this destruction also created opportunities. New ways of doing things emerged, not because they were better, but because the old ways had died with their practitioners. The relationship between town and countryside was transformed. Urban centres that had been growing steadily for centuries suddenly found themselves depopulated. The complex networks of trade and communication that had connected distant regions were disrupted. Some towns never recovered, becoming ghost settlements that served as monuments to a world that had vanished. Others rebuilt themselves along different lines, adapting to new realities with a flexibility that would have been impossible under the old order. Yet for all these changes, life continued. Children were born into this transformed world, and to them, the new realities were simply the way things were. They learned different lessons than their parents had, developed different expectations, and created different traditions. The plague had not ended human civilization. It had forced it to reinvent itself. The survivors carried within them the memory of the dying, but they also carried the knowledge that they had endured. This combination of trauma and resilience shaped everything they did. They built their new world with one eye on the past they had lost and another on the future they were creating. They were more cautious than their ancestors had been, but also more flexible. They had learned that nothing was permanent, that everything could change, and that survival required adaptation. In the end, the medieval plagues did more than kill. They transformed. They took a world built on certainty and tradition and forced it to confront the fundamental uncertainty of existence. The survivors who emerged from the Great Dying were different people living in a different world, carrying within them both the scars of their experience and the hard-won wisdom that comes from looking death in the face and continuing to live. The plagues had changed everything, but they hadn't changed everything equally. As the dust settled on the devastation of the Black Death and its recurring waves, medieval Europe found itself transformed in ways both profound and subtle. The world that emerged from the shadow of mass death was not simply a wounded version of what came before. It was something entirely new, forged in the crucible of survival and shaped by the hard lessons of mortality. The most immediate change was demographic. Villages that once housed dozens of families now echoed with emptiness. Fields that had been worked for generations lay fallow, their furrows slowly disappearing under weeds and wildflowers. The careful social fabric that had bound communities together for centuries had been torn apart, leaving survivors to navigate a world where the old certainties no longer held. Children grew up in houses too large for their shrunken families, inheriting responsibilities they were never meant to bear so young. But demographic collapse brought unexpected opportunities. Land that had been scarce became abundant. Peasants who had never dreamed of owning property found themselves with choices their grandparents could never have imagined. The rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval society for centuries began to crack under the pressure of necessity. Lords who had once commanded absolute obedience now found themselves negotiating with survivors who knew their own value. The basic economics of feudalism shifted when there simply weren't enough hands to work the land. Labour became precious in a way it had never been before. The peasants who survived the plagues discovered they could demand higher wages, better conditions, and more freedom of movement. The old system of binding workers to the land became increasingly difficult to enforce when every lord was competing for the same scarce pool of labourers. What had once been a seller's market for lordship became a buyer's market for work. The survivors learned to leverage their survival into something approaching prosperity. The church, too, was transformed by the plague's devastation. Monasteries that had stood for centuries found themselves with more land than they could manage, and fewer monks to tend it. The careful theological explanations for suffering that had sustained medieval spirituality began to strain under the weight of such massive, seemingly random loss. If God was testing the faithful, why had so many devout believers perished while others survived? The plague forced a reckoning with questions that had no easy answers. Yet perhaps the most profound change was psychological. The survivors of the Great Plagues carried with them a different relationship to time, to security, to the future itself. They had seen how quickly the world could change, how fragile the structures of civilization really were. This wasn't the gradual awareness of mortality that comes with age, but a sudden, violent education in the precariousness of existence. They had watched their world die, and had somehow lived to see what came next. This awareness manifested in different ways. Some survivors became more religious, more devoted to prayer and pilgrimage, seeking meaning in the face of such overwhelming loss. Others became more secular, more focused on the immediate pleasures and pains of daily life. The plague had stripped away many illusions about divine justice and earthly reward. What remained was a harder, more practical wisdom about survival and adaptation. The art and literature of the post-plague period reflected this new consciousness. The elaborate allegories and courtly romances that had dominated medieval culture gave way to more direct, more personal expressions of experience. The dance of death became a common motif, not as a morbid obsession, but as a realistic acknowledgement of life's fragility. Beauty was appreciated more intensely because it was understood to be temporary. Trade patterns shifted as well. The old commercial networks that had connected medieval Europe had been disrupted by the plague's march across the continent. But new networks emerged, often more efficient and more flexible than what had come before. Survivors were willing to travel farther, take greater risks, and adapt more quickly to changing circumstances. The plague had taught them that stability was an illusion anyway. The surviving communities developed new forms of social organization. Extended families became more important, as nuclear families were decimated. Craft guilds and merchant associations took on roles that had once been filled by feudal obligations. The church continued to provide structure and meaning, but it now competed with secular institutions in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Technology and innovation accelerated in the post-plague period. Labor shortages encouraged the development of new tools and techniques that could accomplish more with fewer hands. The printing press, which would transform European culture, emerged partly from the practical need to replace the scribes and scholars who had been lost to plague. Innovation was no longer a luxury, but a necessity for survival. The political landscape changed as well. The old feudal contracts that had governed medieval society were increasingly replaced by cash relationships and wage labor. Kings and lords who had once ruled through personal loyalty and land tenure now found themselves governing through money and market forces. The plague had inadvertently accelerated the transition from feudalism to capitalism. But perhaps most importantly, the plague survivors developed a new understanding of human resilience. They had lived through the worst catastrophe in European history and had somehow managed to rebuild. This wasn't the naive optimism of people who had never faced real hardship. It was the harder, more durable confidence of people who had been tested by circumstances beyond their control and had found ways to endure. The children who grew up in the post-plague world inherited both the trauma and the strength of their parents' generation. They learned to value adaptability over tradition, innovation over convention, and personal ability over inherited status. They were more willing to question authority, more likely to seek their own paths, and more conscious of their own agency in shaping their destinies. The plague had been a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions, but it had also been a great teacher. It had shown medieval Europe what human beings were capable of enduring and what they were capable of rebuilding. The world that emerged from the plague years was scarred but not broken, changed but not defeated. It was a world that had learned to live with uncertainty and to find strength in that very uncertainty. This was the final legacy of the medieval plagues, not just the death and suffering they had caused, but the transformation they had wrought. They had forced European civilization to confront its own mortality and to discover what lay beyond that confrontation. What they found was not an ending, but a beginning, not a collapse, but a metamorphosis. The plagues had ended the medieval world, but they had also created the conditions for whatever would come next. The survivors carried forward the memory of what they had lost, but they also carried forward the knowledge of what they had gained. They had learned that human beings could endure almost anything, and that from the worst destruction could come the most profound renewal. As we reach the end of this long journey through the dark corridors of medieval history, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of understanding something profound about the human condition. The plagues that swept across Europe in those distant centuries were not merely biological events. They were crucibles that tested every assumption about life, faith, society, and survival itself. We have walked through villages where the Black Death arrived like a thief in the night, stealing not just lives, but entire ways of being. We have witnessed the collapse of social structures that had stood for generations, watched as feudal bonds dissolved under the weight of mass mortality, and seen how even the most sacred institutions crumbled when confronted with suffering on an unimaginable scale. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery in this exploration is not how medieval society fell apart, but how it held together, how communities found ways to endure when everything familiar vanished, how people created new rituals when old ones failed them, how they rebuilt not just their homes and fields, but their very understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed determined to prove their insignificance. The plague survivors who emerged from those dark years were not the same people who had entered them. They carried within themselves a different relationship to mortality, to community, to the sacred and the mundane. They had learned that survival was not just about individual strength, but about the threads that bind us to one another, even when those threads seem gossamer thin. In the ashes of the old world, they planted seeds of something new. The economic structures that emerged from the plague years gave workers unprecedented power. The spiritual movements that arose spoke to a more personal, immediate connection with the divine. The art and literature of the post-plague world bore witness to a deeper understanding of both suffering and joy. These medieval ancestors faced their darkness without the benefit of scientific understanding, without modern medicine, without the social safety nets we take for granted. They had only their hands, their voices, their stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. And somehow that was enough. Their legacy is not written in stone monuments or golden treasures. It lives in the simple recognition that humans possess an extraordinary capacity to endure, to adapt, to find meaning even in the midst of meaninglessness. The plague years taught them that civilization is not a finished structure, but an ongoing act of creation, rebuilt fresh each day through countless small choices to care for one another. As we close this chapter of history, we carry with us their quiet wisdom. That survival is not about avoiding suffering, but about transforming it. That communities are not built on prosperity alone, but on the shared acknowledgement of our common vulnerability. That hope is not the absence of darkness, but the decision to light a candle anyway. The medieval plagues ended, as all plagues do, but the deeper truths they revealed about human resilience, about the power of community, about the strange alchemy that turns suffering into strength. These truths remain as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. In learning their stories, we learn something essential about our own capacity to endure, to rebuild, to begin again. The darkness of those medieval years was real and terrible, but it was not the end of the story. It was, in its own way, a beginning. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.